Come on, old man. You think we're stupid? This fake veteran stuff won't work here. The young bank teller's voice carried across the busy lobby as 82-year-old Harold Williams stood frozen at the counter. His worn military ID lay rejected on the marble surface, while dozens of customers turned to stare at the grey-haired man who had survived hell in Vietnam. Harold Williams came to First National Bank every month. Same day, same time. At 82, he walked with a slight limp and kept his head down. His faded army cap and pressed khaki pants were his uniform now. The tremor in his left hand never went away, a reminder of Vietnam that followed him everywhere. He lived alone, kept to himself, and just wanted to cash his disability check without trouble. Harold served 3 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Infantry Division from 1965 to 1968. He came home to a country that did not want him and people who called him names. He learned to stay quiet about his service, found work where he could, and tried to forget. The monthly disability check was not much, but it kept him alive. He earned every penny through blood and pain, though he never talked about it. The trouble started when Harold walked up to the counter where a young teller named Jessica was working. She looked maybe 22, fresh out of college with perfectly styled blonde hair and bright red lipstick. Her name tag was shiny and new, and she wore it like a badge of authority. Harold placed his military ID and disability paperwork on the counter, like he had done dozens of times before. Jessica picked up the ID card and immediately frowned. She held it up to the light, turning it over in her hands like she was examining a suspect dollar bill. "This looks really old," she said loud enough for people in line behind Harold to hear, "and kind of beat up too." Harold explained quietly that the card was from the 1960s, which is why it looked worn. But Jessica was not listening. She was already shaking her head and making clicking sounds with her tongue. "I don't know about this," she announced to anyone within earshot. "We've been having a lot of problems with fake military IDs lately. People print them off the internet and think they can fool us." The man behind Harold in line stepped closer to get a better look. A woman with 2 small children moved her kids away from Harold like he might be dangerous. Someone whispered something about scammers, and Harold felt his face getting hot. Jessica called over her supervisor, Mike Patterson, a heavy-set man in his 40s, wearing a cheap suit and a power tie. Patterson had worked at the bank for 8 years and had developed an inflated sense of his own importance. He strutted over to the counter like a sheriff arriving at a crime scene. "What seems to be the problem, Jessica?" Patterson asked, loud enough for half the bank to hear. "This gentleman is trying to cash a disability check, but his military ID looks suspicious," Jessica replied, holding up Harold's card like it was evidence in a criminal trial. Patterson took the card and examined it with exaggerated care, squinting at it and holding it up to the overhead lights. He made a big show of comparing the photo to Harold's face, shaking his head disapprovingly. "Sir, this identification appears to be quite old and worn," Patterson declared in an official-sounding voice. "How do we know this is legitimate?" Harold tried to explain that military IDs from the Vietnam era looked different from modern ones, but Patterson cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Anyone can make these cards nowadays," Patterson announced to the growing crowd of spectators. "We've had 3 cases of veteran benefit fraud just this month. People think they can waltz in here with fake paperwork and steal money they didn't earn." The accusation hit Harold like a slap across the face. Several customers had stopped their business to watch the drama unfold. An elderly couple whispered to each other and pointed at Harold. 2 young women took out their phones and started recording. A businessman in an expensive suit shook his head in disgust. "I don't think this is real," Jessica said, tapping Harold's ID card against the counter. "It looks like something you could make on a computer." Harold's hands started shaking worse. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, and the voices around him were getting louder and more hostile. "Sir, we're going to need additional proof of your military service," Patterson declared like a judge pronouncing sentence. "This card could easily be a fake, and we don't process benefits for fraudulent claims." A woman behind Harold muttered something about how disgusting it was, for people to lie about being veterans. Another person said they had seen a news story about fake military ID scams. Someone else wondered out loud why Harold could not just provide real documentation if he was legitimate. Patterson was enjoying the attention now. He had an audience, and he was playing to them like an actor on a stage. "We see this all the time," he explained to the crowd. "People think they can fool us with homemade military cards and collect benefits they never earned. It's stealing from real veterans who actually served their country." The irony of his words was lost on Patterson, who had never spent a day in uniform but was now lecturing about military service. Harold tried to speak up, to explain that he really had served, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. Jessica rolled her eyes and sighed dramatically. "Look, if you were really a veteran, you would have better proof than this beat-up old card. Real veterans carry proper documentation." The security guard, a young man named Tommy who had been hired just 6 months earlier, approached the counter. With his hand resting on his radio, he was trying to look official and important, but mostly he just looked confused. "Is there a problem here?" Tommy asked, looking back and forth between Harold and Patterson. Patterson nodded gravely like he was reporting a major crime. "Possible benefit fraud. This individual claims to be a disabled veteran, but we have serious concerns about his documentation." Tommy looked Harold up and down, taking in his trembling hands and nervous demeanor. To someone with no military experience, Harold looked more like a criminal than a hero. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while we sort this out," Tommy said, in what he hoped was an authoritative voice. Harold felt trapped. The crowd was getting bigger. People were pulling out, their phones to record video. Children were staring at him like he was some kind of monster. The whispers were getting louder, and Harold could catch bits and pieces of what people were saying. Disgusting. Fake veteran. Should be arrested. Stealing from real soldiers. Harold's breathing became shallow and rapid. His left leg, weakened by old shrapnel wounds, started to buckle slightly. The panic was building in his chest like it had so many times before, but never in such a public setting. Patterson was not finished with his performance. He held up Harold's paperwork like he was a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the kind of fraud we're trained to watch for," he announced to the assembled crowd. "People who think they can steal benefits from our brave veterans by pretending to be something they're not." The crowd murmured their approval. Someone said Patterson was doing a good job protecting taxpayer money. Another person suggested they should call the police to arrest Harold for fraud. Harold wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but his legs would not move. He was frozen in place while dozens of strangers judged him and found him guilty without knowing anything about his life or his service. Jessica picked up the phone at her station. "Should I call the police?" she asked Patterson, loud enough for everyone to hear. Patterson pretended to consider this carefully, stroking his chin like a wise judge. "Let's see if he can provide legitimate documentation first. If not, we may have to involve law enforcement." Harold's vision started to blur around the edges. The voices became distant and echoing, like he was hearing them from underwater. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. This was worse than any firefight in Vietnam, because at least then he knew who the enemy was. The crowd pressed closer, eager to see how this drama would end. Someone suggested Harold looked guilty because he was sweating so much. Another person said real veterans would never let themselves get so worked up over a simple request for documentation. Harold tried one more time to explain that his military records were at home, that he had never needed to bring discharge papers to cash his monthly check before, but his voice was so quiet and shaky that no one could hear him over the murmur of the crowd. Patterson raised his hands for silence like he was addressing a town hall meeting. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but getting emotional won't change the fact that we need proper verification. If you can't provide legitimate proof of your military service, we cannot process your claim." Just when Harold thought things could not get any worse, when he was about to collapse from the shame and panic, the bank's front door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall with a thunderous bang that made everyone jump. Harold felt like he was drowning in a sea of hostile faces. Every accusing stare felt like a knife cutting into old wounds that had never properly healed. The panic was building in his chest, that familiar tightness that always came when the memories got too close to the surface. He thought about all the times he had been treated like his service did not matter. The airport in 1968 when protesters called him a baby killer. The job interviews where employers saw his military record and suddenly found reasons not to hire him. Sarah's letter explaining why she could not wait for a broken soldier to come home. General Robert Hayes walked through that door like a force of nature. Even in civilian clothes, the 70-year-old retired Army general commanded immediate attention. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his back ramrod straight, and his steel-grey eyes swept the room with the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers. Hayes had been driving past when he noticed the commotion through the window. Something about the scene triggered his instincts. When he got closer and saw Harold's army cap and the way he stood despite his obvious distress, Hayes knew exactly what was happening. The crowd parted automatically as Hayes approached the counter. There was something about his presence that demanded respect, even from people who had never served in the military. "What seems to be the problem here?" Hayes asked in a voice that cut through the noise like a commanding officer calling for attention. Patterson, still riding high on his moment of authority, puffed out his chest and tried to match Hayes's commanding presence. "Sir, this is a private bank matter. We're dealing with a suspected case of veteran benefit fraud." Hayes stepped closer to Harold and immediately recognized the signs he had seen in thousands of combat veterans over his 40-year career. The way Harold held his shoulders despite his back pain. The 1,000-yard stare that never quite went away. The bronze star pin on his cap that was worn smooth from handling. "Soldier, what's your name and unit?" Hayes asked Harold directly, his voice firm but respectful. Harold straightened up as much as his damaged spine would allow. Something about Hayes's tone triggered muscle memory from decades past. "Harold Williams, sir. 1st Infantry Division, 1965 to 1968. Hayes nodded slowly, recognizing the significance of those dates and that unit. "The big red one. I served with 1st ID myself, son. Where were you stationed in country?" "Coochie and Long Bin, sir. Did 3 tours before they sent me home." The general's expression grew thunderous as he turned to face Patterson and Jessica. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 4 decades of military command and the righteous anger of a man who had seen too many good soldiers disrespected. "This man is a legitimate combat veteran of the Vietnam War," Hayes declared, loud enough for every person in that bank to hear. "The 1st Infantry Division saw some of the heaviest fighting of that entire conflict. I can tell just by looking at him that he carries the physical and emotional scars of his service to this country." General Hayes was not finished. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, slapping it down on the counter with enough force to make Patterson jump. "I am retired General Robert Hayes, former commanding officer of the 82nd Airborne Division and recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross. This veteran's identification is completely legitimate. His service record is beyond question, and his sacrifices for this nation are something you clearly cannot comprehend." The bank lobby fell dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop as every person in that room realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Patterson's face drained of all color as he read the business card with shaking hands. Jessica looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. Hayes continued, his voice rising with each word. "This man served his country with honor and distinction while you were safe at home, probably not even born yet. He earned every single benefit he receives through blood, sacrifice, and service that cost him pieces of his body and his soul. The fact that you would question his integrity and humiliate him in front of a room full of strangers is not just insulting. It's a disgrace to everything this country stands for." The crowd that had been so eager to watch Harold's humiliation now seemed ashamed of their behavior. People looked at their feet and shuffled uncomfortably. Several customers quietly left the bank rather than face the general's withering gaze. Patterson stammered out an apology and quickly processed Harold's paperwork without any further questions. Jessica could barely make eye contact as she completed the transaction, her hands shaking as she counted out Harold's money. Harold Williams walked out of that bank with more than just his monthly check. For the first time in decades, someone had stood up for him and recognized that his service mattered. General Hayes had given him back something he thought he had lost forever: his dignity and the knowledge that his sacrifices were real and meaningful. Sometimes it takes one person with courage and moral authority to remind everyone else what honor really looks like. Our veterans earned their benefits in places most of us will never see, doing things most of us will never have to do, so we can live free and safe. They deserve our respect, not our suspicion.